So hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome here at Exploratorium, and also welcome in our live stream. My name is Mathias Maschat, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's talk in our Denkraum Improvisation, our thinking space improvisation, how we call it. I'm very happy that sound artist and composer Andrea Parkins has accepted my invitation and that we can talk about her work and thought today. The title of our talk is Correspondences, the Body and Material in Sound Installation and Performance. First of all, this obviously refers to Andrea's work, Andrea being particularly interested in the interrelations of body and material and also sound and space and so on. But it also refers to an interest of mine, if I may say so, that I have been pursuing already in other talks here in my Key Concept series, in which I am trying to collect all kinds of relevant topics and concepts and ideas, theories around the issue of improvisation. So why should the body and material be of any importance in improvisation? Simply said, because we ascribe a certain agency also to the improviser's body as well as to the materials being used in the course of the performative activity of improvising. And I'm really glad to follow up on this topic and to hear Andrea about her notion and use of the body and material. Andrea Parkins is active in music since her early childhood. She has been an active composer and improviser in the States, and since quite a few years, she is an integral part of the Berlin Echtzeitmusik scene. She's not only an improviser, but also works in the field of performance and in sound and intermedia installation. And additionally to this, Andrea also holds a degree in visual arts. Lately, Andrea has gained her PhD in artistic research at the Norwegian Academy of Music, and she is now fellow of the Berlin Artistic Research Grant Program. Andrea, thanks a lot for being here.
Matthias, thank
Welcome.
you for inviting me. It's great to be here. And thanks to Exploratorium for hosting us.
So, since we are here at a space entirely dedicated to improvisation, I would like to directly start with this topic. Mm-hmm. You have stated that improvisation has been and is a fundamental process and procedure in all areas of your practice. As a beginning, could you maybe say something about how you have discovered improvisation mm-hmm. and what relevance it has taken over in your artistic development?
Okay. Well, speaking personally, historically, musically, I began as a classical musician. I was a pianist. And then in my teens, I started checking out jazz and thinking about that I'd maybe like to play jazz. And I had one of those things that I call classical musicitis, which is I had no idea how you do that. I would think, how do they do that? How do they improvise? I had no idea. And I could not really find my way into it. I went to Berklee College of Music for a couple of years and learned something about their approach, but it wasn't working for me. It didn't work in any organic way for me that made sense. And so I was quite miserable and still not improvising. But I was eventually making electronic music pieces on tape. I was playing in rock bands, mostly on synthesizer. And in those instances, I'd compose my parts. But sometimes, I'd just sort of get a little messy and just play something. So that was sort of a beginning. And then eventually, one thing that happened, which was pretty tremendous, was that I started studying piano improvisation privately with a gentleman named Harvey Diamond. He was a jazz pianist in Boston. And he had a really amazing pedagogical approach, which was that he didn't judge anything I did. He would ask me to play something, and it was always free. It wasn't about trying to play over chord changes or knowing my chord scales. He would say, just play something. And of course I was terrified, but he was such a nice man, I couldn't say no. And, you know, I mean, there's so much I could do a whole talk about Harvey Diamond, who is still around and still playing and is a wonderful musician. But he would say, play something, and I would play something. And he would say, that's interesting, play something else. And then we would talk about how they were different from each other, but it wasn't a question of value. It was not bad or good. So somehow I forgot myself. I forgot about my ego. I forgot about whether, you know, I was a bloody genius or not. I just became very interested in what I was playing and put myself outside of it. And the other thing that happened along with that was he was very concerned about sound production on the piano and how you elicit, you know, this kind of very rich bass, or, you know, something delicate in the treble range, or some other kind of interesting thing where you're playing lines in the mid-range and they're kind of blending with each other in interesting ways. And that really, no piano teacher I had ever had talked about sound like this. And so it was about being able to play freely, and it was also about exploring sound. And so those two happened kind of together. And of course, I was already exploring sound as an electronic music composer as well. So that was the beginning of improvisation. But I also saw very quickly how social it could be. I started playing on late-night free-form college radio in the Boston area with some friends. And we were just playing, you know, with, you know, hacked electronics and junk. One friend gave me an accordion, and that's when I started playing accordion in the middle of the night on Tufts University radio station. Okay. But it was really it wasn't about finesse, it wasn't about playing beautiful solos, it wasn't about any of that, it was just discovering things. So I saw improvisation as a way of discovering something, a sound, a way of interacting, to create an atmosphere, something like this.
Yeah, then I can well imagine that you could just continue that path.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. With a little more obsession as I went, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, now you have finally even written a PhD about your research, or about your artistic practice, I should rather say.
Yes, a bit of both.
You just finished in May, so it's pretty recent still.
Yes.
And yeah, I must say that I'm really fascinated about it, how you put everything together, because it seems that there's so much in it which you have been following since years already. So it really added up, and you could develop further a few things. And just so that was a possibility to really put all this together in this piece somehow, which is, by the way, you can read it online. And yeah, let's maybe talk about the title. The title is Sonic Spaces for the Stray, Diffusing Dislocation in Sound Installation and Performance. Could you, first of all, explain what the project was basically about? What were the ideas behind it?
Well, like many artistic research projects, it changed. In the beginning, it was my intention. Well, it's strange. In a way, it changed, and in a way, I realized in the end I did what I said I was going to do, which was a bit shocking, because this was also a pandemic PhD. So, you know, I was, you know, not really in doubt about what I would end up with, if anything. You know, I thought, I don't think this is going to work. But my intention was to create a body of sound installations and performances that use the interactive electronics that I've been using for many years, which is a big part of my practice, as a way to understand more about what my gestural relationship as a performer, and maybe even as a composer, is in space. And I thought I would be mainly concerning myself with different kinds of diffusion systems, you know, like going into a recording studio and figuring out if an ambisonic installation is the thing I want to do, or do I want to do field synthesis, or do I want to do, you know, some weird acousmonia, you know, different kinds of systems for diffusing sound, you know, propagating sound in a space, let's say, another way to say it. So in a way, I did end up doing that, but the process was nothing I could have imagined, because we couldn't imagine what that time would be like, and we had to, I think a lot of people had to invent ways of making things and being together or not being together and generating stuff, or deciding that it's okay not to generate stuff. That's also something that happened during the pandemic, where you do less or one thing. For me, very quickly, you know, I didn't have access to studios anymore. I was starting to work at home, like a lot of people. And I found myself really wanting to pare things down to an extreme extent, so that I could really understand more about, well, what's my relationship between a gesture and a sound that I make? What is the tension in between? How can I explore what that is? What is the resistance? You know, what happens if I try to do something and it doesn't quite work, but something else happens? What is the creative potential of that? Mm-hmm. So that kind of did happen. And the other thing I should mention, which was also the intention of the project that I did carry through with, was that I have a very strong interest in the writing of the French psychoanalytic feminist Julia Kristeva, who has a theory around the notion of abjection. And she's speaking about abjection in terms of how infants, the stages that infants go through, you know, when they're kind of not able to differentiate between themselves and the mother, or themselves and the breast, and you know, they're kind of shitty and they're milky and they're pukey and they're kind of falling apart, and it's not very nice, probably. Well, we don't know. But and then they go into another phase, which has to do with language, where they lose that connection. I started thinking a long time ago that because of the way I improvise, where I use many things at once, that it's almost out of my control, and that there's almost kind of a point where I'm embarrassed that I can't quite be virtuosic, or I can't quite carry through on something. And this is something she's also talking about. She talks about shame. And, you know, it's all very psychoanalytic and creepy. But I felt that there was something in it for me in thinking about my own discomfort with, on the one hand, wanting to be virtuosic, and on the other hand, completely mistrusting it and wondering if there's something else that's more interesting than that. And trying to look at where is this place that might almost fall apart, where something else happens. So that's what the intention was. The result actually did that, and the process was very different than I expected. And today, maybe if we have time, I can show some things about that process.
Yes, definitely. I think that that was a really important point that you have just mentioned in the end of what you said, that you try to lose control in a way. Virtuosity is not what you exactly want, but you're searching for something to happen what you don't know, which is going to be happen yet.
Something out of control a bit.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's a bit ironic about it all is that I've been working for a very long time with a piece of custom-built software that initially was meant to emulate a kind of standalone sampler that I used to play, the ASR-10, which was a beautiful sampler that you put your samples in with floppy disks. This is quite some time ago. And it sounded great, and the great thing about this machine is that you could kind of make it mess up. And it sounded fantastic. It would glitch, it would just happen, and sometimes you wouldn't know when it would happen, but when it did, I thought, this is great. How can I get this to happen some more? So when I moved over to software, I asked the programmer I was working with, whose name I want to mention because he's wonderful as a musician, electronic musician and media artist, Matthew Ostrowski, lives in New York, and he's also a terrific Max programmer. Anyway, Matthew and I have been working on this patch for 20 years. We started 20 years ago, and it's changed over time. But the idea was to create an instrument that is like an improvising partner that you can't really predict what they're going to do, which is, of course, what happens when you're improvising with a human being. Over time, I've gotten pretty good at predicting what the thing can do, and so I have to keep changing it. So in a way, I've gotten virtuosic about working with this instrument that's supposed to keep me from being virtuosic. So it's kind of a weird...
there's always this kind of paradox in a way.
It's a weird conundrum. You know, I'm getting good at doing it badly, you know. So,
Yeah, we will see some examples of this a little bit later.
Yes.
But so you have already mentioned the notion of abjection, of the abject. And I think that somehow it might relate also to the title in your of your PhD project, right? So
Yes,
there's
it does.
sonic spaces for the stray.
Yes.
I'm sorry. And also the dislocation aspect. As a non-narrative English speaker, I'm not sure if I can fully grasp the meaning of the different terms and their connection. And so, it might be good to have a first impression of these.
Sure,
And
sure.
I feel that already your use of these terms offer a lot of context already. So first of all, what does stray mean to you and within this context? My understanding of the term is that you are particularly interested in focusing on the sounds that usually might be neglected or that even get lost since no one's paying attention to them. Is that
Poor little sounds.
Yeah.
I think, okay, so
the
the name
stray,
of the PhD title was Sonic Spaces for the Stray, and then it had parentheses around the DIF in diffusing, so that was kind of clever. Whatever, I'm diffusing something. I can't, so long I can't remember the title.
So
But
it has the diffusion and the fusion at the same time.
Yeah, diffusion and fusion is kind of nice. So I like language. I love the English language. I like playing with the different, meanings for a single word. So sonic spaces for the stray. I was thinking about the stray in a couple of senses. Of course, there's like a stray hair that gets away when you put your hair up. There's also like the stray thread that is kind of makes you look a little messy. And then there's like a stray cat, the cat that got away and is wandering around. There's straying into a territory that might be unfamiliar. So all of these things to me speak of something to do with things not being in place, or maybe something to do with not belonging. To be wandering, to be maybe even in exile, or just not having your place. You're stray. And there's actually a super beautiful line in Kristeva, which I happen to have with me, because I was really thinking. I hope I can find it. Let's see. If I can find this thing, because I really love what she says about this. This might take a minute. Maybe.
What was it, page 8?
It might be here also.
Okay, yeah.
Because I wrote a text about this some years ago, and I quoted extensively from Kristeva in it, but actually the way I did it is that I had my mother speaking, so that's my mother talking, but she's speaking about Kristeva. Okay, she says, an exile who asks where. The one by whom the abject exists is thus a deject who places himself, separates himself, situates himself, and therefore strays, instead of getting his bearings, desiring, belonging, or refusing. Situationist in a sense, and not without laughter, since laughter is a way of placing or displacing, dislocating, abjection. Necessarily dichotomous, somewhat Manichaean, I'm not sure what that means. He divides, excludes, and without properly speaking, wishing to know his objection, is not at all unaware of them. Often, moreover, he includes themselves among them, thus casting within himself the scalpel that carries out his separations. So she keeps going back to this idea of the stray. Instead of sounding himself as to his being, he does so concerning his place. Where am I instead of who am I? So this, for me, is about space rather than identity. like the place you're in, not so much who you are. Anyway, and then it goes on and on. The tireless builder, the deject is in short astray. He's on a journey during the night, the end of which keeps receding. And the more he strays, the more he is saved. So I'm very touched by this. And I don't entirely know what it means, but it evokes something for me. So I was very much wanting to think about that as part of the title and a part of how I made the piece that I finally made for the PhD.
Yeah, when we've been talking, you said that also the sound of the language is really important to you.
It is, and that's something why I said this is my mother speaking. I actually made these recordings of my mother doing this Kristeva texts when she was about 80, and she's now 96. So I have had these recordings for a long time. And the reason I asked her to read them, she loved the sound of them. I have a very, very early memory of my mother reading poetry to me, and I don't remember what the poetry was about, but I still can hear the sound of her voice. So for me, the sound of language might carry even more meaning than, the words. That it's the sound of the language that has the meaning for me that I'm probably more interested in, but it's also language.
I think the term dislocation also just came from Kristeva. Is that right?
Well, she says displace. She doesn't use dislocation.
Okay, yeah.
The dislocation issue is interesting for me because we didn't talk about this earlier, but there is kind of a trend and tendency in the arts right now towards immersion, this notion of immersion. And I'm not quite sure what I think about immersion. I think immersion can feel great. It can feel great to jump in the pool. It can feel great to be at a demonstration where you all believe in the same thing and it's going, you feel close and solid with each other. It can feel great to be at a pop concert and you're all responding, kind of entrained in the movement of listening. All of this can feel great and encompassing and immersive until you want to get out of it or until it goes wrong. And for me, it even, I've been in demonstrations that have gotten super ugly and had to go, and I'm very small, so, I felt kind of out of physical control. It also somehow erases for me the particularity of individual experience, or subjective experience, I think, better way to put it. So I would really like to make pieces that you can step in and out of as a listener, that, maybe you're making a large-scale sound installation, but maybe it's more like, if I'm over here, it sounds like this, and if I'm over there, it sounds like that, and I'm not missing anything. In an ambisonic piece where there's a sweet spot, and where it's better to sit. And you don't really hear the piece as it's intended unless you're in the sweet spot. I don't want to make things like that. I want to make things where it's interesting no matter where you are, and that what you hear is the point. So that was one way I was thinking about dislocation. I was thinking about, can I make pieces where there's no single point where you get all of it, that there's always a loss, that there's always something you have to give up, that there's always a little bit of a poignancy about that. And then there's also, on a very personal level, I have a family story of migration and immigration, and families that were separated and that never came together again. And without getting into the details, I'm certain that intergenerational experience has affected me, and I think that's something else I'm talking about. But I want to make stuff that evokes that state of being without naming it in narrative. That's really, I don't want to tell the story. I want to, have the work evoke something that might be that.
So there's really different layers. There's the sound, you're talking about the sound, you're talking about aesthetic ideas, you're talking about autobiographical aspects,
and
about
history,
metaphorical aspects.
and politics too,
In what way?
Well, sometimes I experience immersive pieces. I would like to find another word to use, but a bit fascistic. You know, you know, you're in it, you got to be in it.
In the sense of totalitarian.
Yeah, it feels totalizable and totalitarian a bit, sometimes, not always. I also really love Lamont Young. So, you know, I mean, there's a lot of music and sound and experience in the arts that are immersive that I enjoy, but I have some nervousness about the idea that it's great and we have to be in it. I'm like, maybe not. I want to resist it a little.
And in this combination of the words fusion like melting, and diffusion. Diffusion.
So the words
in
diffusion.
the sense of expansion.
Yeah.
Can you go a bit more into detail about this?
Yeah. Well,
is it the same thing that you've been talking about?
It's a little different. I mean, I think the word is diffusing, and I've separated the DIF and left it with fusing. And when I think of fusing, for me, that's like a coming together, but it's also working against the coming together, and also something that's ignited, like a fuse is igniting, you know, so that there's some kind of energy there. So I'm just playing with language, but I hope it's all in the work. I hope.
Yeah, maybe we should have a few examples about this.
Okay. Should we?
Yeah, maybe we should just start with having a look into
yeah, I can do that.
Maybe the object parts first.
I just want to sort of say briefly, if for those of you that might not know my work, I'm an improvising performer, and I'm making installations, as we talked about. And for a long time, I studied the visual arts, and I had a drawing practice especially that I kind of dropped because I lived in New York City and I couldn't keep a studio anymore, and I kind of got deeply involved with music. But over the last years, my visual arts practice and sonic practice have come together in some interesting ways. So part of what I do is, and if you've seen images, promoting this event, you probably see me on the floor, you know, with drawing tools in my hands, and those are amplified. And those are just more objects that I'm working with as a way to examine what my body's doing when I'm performing. During the pandemic, I thought as I said, I was going to be making lots of installations and working in studios, but instead I was in my new apartment, which had no furniture, because I had just moved there. And I started a movement practice working with a movement artist in Oslo on Zoom. Her name is Olive Beringa. And the movement practice is called authentic movement. It's also called movement in depth. I think that was the earlier name for it, and I think it's a nicer name, actually. And so I was just doing authentic movement with her, and what this is a practice wherein, for a timed period, you move with your eyes closed, and you move as you wish, how you want to. You might not move. You do whatever you feel like. It's improvising, but with not a very performative agenda, rather a self-experiential, subjective agenda. And I was doing this with Olive on Zoom for months. Twice a week we would do this. And eventually I started picking up stuff around my house, sound objects, and big pieces of paper, stuff like that, and using those as ways to explore sound in my space. But before I did that, I realized I'm jumping ahead. I started by wanting to examine just generally how I'm working with materials. And I started thinking about, what about small gestures? What are the small gestures that I'm making when I perform with my instruments, working with objects? So this is a short piece. I made, during lockdown in my apartment, 15 etudes, I'm calling them for video, called Small Objects, Small Gestures. Mm-hmm. And this is
Just one thing,
Yes.
we cannot talk at the same time like we play the music, just that you know.
Well, we shouldn't.
We shouldn't. Yeah, okay. Okay, so you start?
I hope this works. I truly do. Let's see what happens. We're lacking sound, I'm afraid. Okay, this is a technical issue. It's not on. Something's feeding back. Of course, this was working before we started. Okay, something is happening. I don't know where the feedbacks are. The mics? Is it the mics?
It's like this is so nice. It's like Zoom. How it never works on Zoom. Okay, let's see what happens.
So, just a few things to say about that. That's working with objects, just the microphone directly on the computer. It's running through the processing that I was telling you about, the custom-built instrument, which is a Max MSP patch. That's what I'm calling a custom-built instrument, for those of you who might or might not know what that's about. So I'm just working with a minimum of sound processing, and it was really rough. I was actually recording them on Zoom, but in fact there was no one on the other side of the screen. This was probably in April of 20. And just really very solitary, very soloistic, really fragmentary. And as I said, I was just really thinking about these little gestures and the little objects, and what is the relationship? How do I make music or sound or something that feels coherent to me in some way? And for me also, it's one end of the scale in which I'm thinking about gesture, like the hand, the fingers, and manipulating a small object, but then also imagining, I think I said, one end of my exploration of scale, and that is my body's performative interaction with objects and instruments, and my desire ultimately to extend or expand or even explode that scale as a performer or in conjunction with materials. How small can it be? How big can it be? So that's where I started during the lockdown.
So those were the small objects.
Those were the small objects.
Obviously. Yeah. I don't know if you heard Andrea live in a concert already. It's really amazing. I heard quite a few concerts already with also this. I mean, you have several things, also the accordion and more electronics and so on. But it's really fascinating to see how you work with it also in the improvising group. Maybe about the software. You have been influenced on the one hand also by the Ruby Goldberg machines.
Yeah.
And on the other side, you also mentioned George Lewis and his Voyager setup, of course.
Yeah.
So where's the connection for you with those references in your work and in your software?
So Rube Goldberg, for those of you that don't know, was an inventor, and he was famous for making You've probably all seen a Rube Goldberg machine. It's, like you drop the ball, it goes through the channel, it knocks something over, that sets something on fire, and then something else gets knocked over, and then that explodes. And the best example of a Rube Goldberg machine that I can think of that's online is the artist Fishley and Weiss's piece, The Way Things Go, which is a beautiful, beautiful piece. And they are beautiful artists. So I was thinking of a way to do sound processing with the software that would somehow have that kind of a logic, something causal, and there are more there are terms in engineering for this, but I'm not an engineer, so I'm not using those terms. But I also wanted this to somehow misfire occasionally, so that whatever logic I thought was going to happen might not happen. So what does that effectively mean? I think that there's going to be a delay, and I press a button, and sometimes there is and sometimes there isn't. And if there isn't, what's going to happen? I think that I'm going to do a pitch shift, but it doesn't happen. Something else happens. Suddenly there's this crazy glissando. I don't know where it came from. And I have to deal with it. And of course, if I was improvising with another human being, I would have to deal with it. So I'm dealing with it. It's a lot like life. Of course, as I said, I'm getting better and better at learning how to deal with it, sometimes like life.
So there are a lot of surprises implemented.
There's surprises, and if I want to keep it surprising, I go back with Matthew Ostrowski to the drawing board. I'm like, could you make it more surprising? Because I'm starting to not be surprised. So that's one side. I hope that's clear. The other side is that the composer and computer music pioneer and incredible musicologist and theoretician Georgie Lewis very early on created a composition and program called Voyager, which was really this idea of having the computer functioning as an improvisation partner. So that was like a big inspiration for me. And he writes about it really beautifully too. I think he may have even done something recently here in Berlin with Voyager. I think Magda Myers played
Yeah, it was
with Voyager.
I think on the Jazz Fest last year.
Yes, exactly. And, I mean, it's a really remarkable instrument and program. It's beautiful. But yeah, that inspired me too. So those were some things at the beginning of this, developing the software so that it could do this thing that I wanted it to do. But, I think it's also important to look at who has done it and maybe who has done it better, who did it first anyway, and really, take note of that.
What I really find interesting or fascinating is that the software, the interactive programming becomes an extension of your body then in a way. So you have the gestures that are reacting on what is surprisingly happening. And so you are reacting on this. And what's your experience with this combination of the gestural approach and the interactivity of the software?
It's exciting. I mean, it's hard to. I think this is where the word correspondences come into play. I refer to correspondences thinking about the anthropologist Tim Ingold, and he talks about correspondence in terms of what happens when a human being interacts with material and what are the forces in that interaction. What's that space between, or what makes the matter and the body do something, and he talks about someone flying a kite, for example, and you have a kite and you have a string and you have a person, and it's not really happening until it's up in the air and somebody is running with it. So there's the movement, and then there's also the air and the wind. And what happens with the potential of this material to seize the wind and do something else that it wasn't doing before. So I was really thinking, he calls that the dance of animacy. So I was thinking about that with this idea of correspondences. But not just material and body, but also space and site and situation. And the situation that I was in during the lockdown was in my apartment. So I'm wondering if I should show, since I already started talking about the authentic movement.
Yeah, let's continue with this.
Was there something else you wanted to ask?
Not to ask, but I just wanted to say that if anybody else has questions or remarks, maybe that's also possible to jump in anytime.
Yeah, stop me.
The only thing is, please use a microphone.
Yeah.
I can come with a microphone because we are live streaming and recording, so it's only for this.
Yeah.
See, you don't hear yourself in the room, but yeah.
Maybe that would be nice.
Yeah?
Yeah,
But
I mean, if anybody does have any questions, this could be a bit more.
Yeah. I mean, anytime. We can just continue
conversational.
with
You don't have
with
to, but if you want to, you can.
We can continue with the next piece of yours.
Yes.
And then,
Yeah, I wanted. I sort of introduced this in the wrong order, which I hope you'll forgive me. So I'm going back to authentic movement in depth, and me being in that apartment where I was doing these little things with the little objects, and then starting to work with Olive Baringa from Oslo online. And what I meant to continue to say about that is that so with authentic movement, you're doing a timed period of movement. Someone is watching you, and they're witnessing you, actually. I think that's the better word for it. When you're done with, let's say you move for 10 minutes, you try to remember what you did, you try to articulate that, at least the way we did it, and then the person that is witnessing you tells you what they saw. And it becomes quite intense, and so Olive was in Oslo watching me in my empty house moving. And so there's another piece of displacement, but it actually felt very intimate in the way that Zoom sometimes can feel intimate. Sometimes it can be a little like that. So we did that, and I made some pieces. I recorded a lot of stuff, and I turned them into little films that I liked which I think was also something that many people did during lockdown. You know, they kind of documented what they were doing, and some of these things actually turned into the things themselves, which is sort of what happened to me. So this one is called Room Divining, and with it I was taking large pieces of paper and doing authentic movement, but I was trying to listen for the edges of my room. So just really with my eyes shut, just sweeping the room and sort of trying to figure out where I was. And the thing about authentic movement, why do it? Besides the fact you're improvising movement, it helps you figure out where you are in space. I think it helps develop a sense of proprioception, which for me feels really important if I'm thinking about my body as a performer and in relation to space and materials and other people. So that seemed important to me. So I will just play this one. Ready? Turn that off.
Wrong fader. Ready? All right.
something I wanted to say about that is part of why I was working with bigger objects was I was trying to figure out how to get the same kind of physical challenge that I have with the small objects and the kind of tension between could I work with something much larger. It was just the beginning of trying to work with, bigger pieces of paper. But also, I should mention, I don't know if you heard some feedback occasionally. That's because it was going through my software instrument. So again, there is that kind of moment sometimes where I become very still. I'm not moving. That's because I'm waiting for the feedback either to stop or to start again. So I'm still playing with the instrument, but using, the whole room, the resonance in the room, not a very good sounding room, but a room, with resonance, and the objects and the feedback together from the instrument. So that was my intention. But it was also important for me to build a more physical challenge. That's sort of part of what all of this is leading to in some way. And it's also a way to extend my body. It's one thing to work with these tiny things, but then how to, create a bigger range. If I'm making spatial audio works in my house, how can I do it? Well, make my body bigger, maybe. So that was an idea.
Maybe in connection to the paper you've been using, you're also painting
Drawing.
and drawing. Sorry,
Yeah,
drawing.
Yes.
Do you have a video example of this also? Or
I do. It's not at the ready. It's not.
Okay, it's not for today.
It's not.
No.
I didn't bring it.
It just comes to my mind now that I
Yeah.
see you moving with a paper.
It's cool to watch. It's true, and maybe I can dig it up a little later on. Actually, yes, there's a section. I have a video a little later where I'm collaborating with somebody and I'm drawing a bit. But that was also the idea of, again, trying to explore this place with sound. If you have a drawing tool in your hand and you touch the paper, it makes a mark and it makes a sound. And if my software is going on in the background, the microphone picks up that sound and then it reacts. I started thinking a lot about of the mark as kind of an artifact of this interaction between the sound and the gesture, that the mark is the artifact. As you can see, this is not about making beautiful music. This was meant as research to begin with, and then for me it became something else on its own that I really accept as works. I feel like they function as works, but it's certainly not what I expected I would be doing. During this time, and I got into it. Should I show more stuff?
Yeah.
Do you have a
If
different
there are
question?
no questions right now, then
Questions?
I'm just thinking.
can I just give you the mic?
Oh yeah.
Sorry.
Hello. Hi. My name is Kian.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
You too.
I'm interested in your drawing practice, and also I'm quite into how you embrace many different aspects of your creative practice and sort of bring them all together. And I'm a visual artist, and I also work in performance, or I have in the past at least. And I do find it kind of challenging to bring certain aspects of my visual art practice, or like studio practice, into a more performance space, or more related to my body. And I feel like the performance work I do is very related to my body. And I wanted to know, or maybe it's more of a comment, I don't know, but about your relationship to drawing and how that might have changed, because you said you had quite a strong drawing practice in New York, and that changed due to circumstance. And I wonder if it's really like enmeshed with your sound performance work now, or is that something separate?
It's totally enmeshed with it. And I think it's important to say there's a couple, it's always more complicated than it should be, but that's the way it is. So I studied drawing quite intensively in a kind of school that really favored abstract expressionism and mark making. So I became very adept at that, and I made many, many drawings and many works on paper and even canvas with that. And this was like in my 20s, all through my 20s and into my early 30s. And I started to ask myself, why am I making these marks? Why? And it was the same feeling I had. I became a quite good free jazz pianist after a certain point. And then I asked myself, why am I doing this? I do not understand what is the point. You know, I'm pretty good at this, and you know, it sounds good and it feels good, but what is it? And my feeling in both instances, both with the drawing and the mark making, and with the kind of I would call it free jazz piano playing I was doing, is that I couldn't understand the impetus, and that until I did, I thought I would put it aside. I mean, also I didn't have a studio. There were other reasons why I stopped, you know, with the visual art stuff. It was just quite hard to do at that point. But what happened to me about 5 years ago is I had a residency, and I really had time to think about what do these, you know, I'm one person and I've done these things, and there must be a reason that I've done them. You know, it's not arbitrary, and now would be a really great time for me to figure out how they're connected. And this is, I started drawing again, like really small, and then somehow had the idea to amplify my drawings as I was making them by just adding contact mics to my drawing utensils. And I started to hear that there was like kind of a rhythmic or sonic syntax in the way that I was working with my materials that had very little to do with the visual outcome, but had a lot to do with how it felt physically and what happened sonically. And at the same time, you know, I kind of liked the visual outcome. And part of it was I started by using materials I had used in my 20s. I thought, like, where do I start? Well, like, start where you stopped, you know, do that. And so I was working with different kinds of paper, vellums and, you know, architectural tracing paper and, you know, paper that could hold a lot of water, beautiful, you know, and with different kinds of inks and pencils and oil sticks and charcoal, and very messy. And it was really a joy because I really felt how the sound connected with movement, and then ultimately was making this mark that somehow represented that process. And then I asked myself, are these drawings? Are they, and I'm not sure that they are. I think, I mean, right now I'm calling them artifacts of a process, which sounds pretty pretentious. But in fact, you know, or like a trace of a process. And the way I did it for a while was I would just do one and not spend too much time and just let them stack up and not look at them for a few weeks, and then come back and look at them and see what the tendencies were, which is like how I would teach anybody anything. It's like make a lot and then see what the tendencies are, and then figure out what you want to go with or not go with. So that happened, and then in this studio at this residency, I thought, you know, maybe I'll make a big one. And I put this big piece of paper on the floor, and I walked around it for about 3 weeks. I just like, no, not doing that. And then finally, it was like almost the last week, or it was really at the end. I thought, if you don't do it now, you're never going to do it. And I did it, and I did this big drawing that was really durational because it was bigger. I did it in quad. You know, I really went for it, and made a video of it, which is online somewhere. And I thought, okay, this is interesting, really interesting, because I could really study my movement, my whole body movement, you know, when I would like pick up my leg for no real reason, or, you know, flip over for no real reason, or, you know, just decide I want to do something over in that corner. And it was a kind of, and this was before I was doing authentic movement, you know, it was just very much as I felt it, and I took my time. And tried to, I think I was trying in some way to make it compositional, sonically compositional, like to make it make sense. That's a long answer to a short question. But, okay.
Thanks.
But, yeah, sure. should we go on?
Should go on, yeah.
Yeah. So later, after sweeping the floor with paper while Olive Baringa was watching me in Oslo, I decided to kind of work with just everyday household objects that I had around, and with the idea of trying to work with things that were intentionally difficult, a little too big for me, a little too awkward. Part of that also was in the back of my mind. I had the idea of building another instrument that would be kind of like an extended accordion that would be like way too big for me to play, but somehow is working with feedback and was a bit, and also awkwardness and abjection and all of those things. So I think I was starting to think about, well, what about using bigger objects? Maybe it would be interesting to know how I manage that, or don't, or can I, or maybe it's not a good idea. So, and then I said I used the objects as a means of mining the difficult acoustics in my living room and the potential for my software instrument to sonically explode at exactly the right moment, that is, when I don't expect it. I'm just going to read a little bit about what I said. I said, in this instance, I developed a deeper understanding about my physical interaction with objects as instruments, how I work with physical and acoustic space, and the role that listening has in the practice. And for me, this was kind of moving towards a kind of improvised performance that somehow is situated in intimacy. And maybe it was just because I had this other person watching me. And then I started thinking, well, could I just do little performances in my house where one person comes over wearing a mask and we do this? And I think that happened. People did do things like that. But that seemed pretty radical to me in, April of 20 or whatever it was. Let's watch a bit of this. This is Objects as Instruments. Are you ready?
Well, you said before it's not about making beautiful music, but it has a beauty in its own. It has a quality on its own, I think. And can you once again say something about the setup? How you have the objects in the space, you have the microphones, and it also runs through your software?
Yeah, it's super crude, actually. I mean, it sounds crude, and it is crude. Basically, I have some things in my house. I gathered them together, some pulled curtains off the walls. I mean, really very contingent. Pull the curtains off, down from the windows, took my laundry dryer out of the bathroom. I had some broken clothes racks that I was trying to build a giant accordion out of, just different things that I had around. And then I just had the software running, and the mic is on. And so occasionally it will feed back or pick something up. I saw at one point I got bored with the music, and I think I added a little synth. I have this very tiny synth that I think I put a couple of beats in there for a minute, and then I turned it off because I thought, okay, no, don't do this. But the setup really, when I showed this to a choreographer friend of mine, she said, your eyes are open, like you're not really doing authentic movement, your eyes are open. And it's true, because there's too much to contend with the instruments. I mean, I was really playing them, like the objects became instruments, and I was really playing them in a way that I kind of had to attend to all of their physicality and their objectness. So I couldn't just kind of sink into this thing that I know how to do, And it was very awkward. Things happened. So, for example, those were contact mics, just cheap Korg €14 contact mics, and the cable of one got caught in a big plastic bag, and and talk about abject. I mean, I remember feeling when I did it really embarrassed. And don't forget, someone's watching me. I wasn't by myself. Someone was watching me on Zoom, and I was starting to feel like, okay, this is much more like a performance. And so that was different and interesting how that changed, when something feels like a performance and when you kind of forget that there's someone there, and the difference. And this was, by the end of it, it was beginning to feel like a performance, which I wasn't comfortable with. So. And, it was pretty rough and noisy, I would say. And it was by myself, but what I kind of got from it is that I realized that I'm not just making sound, I'm also listening. Like, I can see myself listening. I could feel myself listening. And that doesn't seem so crazy. I mean, that's not like a big revelation, but there's something about witnessing oneself listen, which I could really see in these videos. And I started thinking a lot about how I could share this rough and noisy research with other people. Other researchers, other artists, and in terms of process or materials and gestures, and also what I thought of as the work's abject aspects. Would that be interesting for someone else? Would they be interested in being uncomfortable in that way, accepting the discomfort? And what I said they're not about making beautiful music, but home in on interruptions of sonic flow, with awkward eruptions of feedback, unintended silences, or just plain ugly sound. And this was the moment when I could locate resonance and reflections, not from another person, but only from the walls and surfaces of the room in which I was in. And I was starting to feel, as interesting as that was, that it would be really nice to be with somebody else and do something with somebody else. So that eventually happened. That lockdown eased. And actually, Magda Myas and I got together at Studio Born 45, which, if you don't know it, is a very large rehearsal and recording studio in Weissensee. And we rented it for about 3 days and just tried everything. And we weren't trying to make a record. We weren't trying to, make a movie. We were just trying. We brought all of our stuff as much as we possibly could, and recorded and video recorded and tried stuff out. Magda if you don't know her, is a pianist, and she works almost exclusively with the inside of the piano using different kinds of objects, a huge array of objects, and she gets a huge array of sound. And she's been doing this a very long time, and it's really beautiful and intricate and deep what she does. This time, we were thinking about what could we do that we don't normally do. She decided that in addition to playing inside piano, in addition to me playing what I usually play, accordion and the electronics, that she would try playing objects outside the piano. And so I brought some, and she brought some, and that was kind of something that she did that was more like my practice. And I actually played piano, which that's the thing that I practice, but I don't play piano in public too much. And it was quite intense to play piano duos with Magda, I must say. There's 2 pianos at the studio, so it was quite amazing. I'm just going to revert to something I wrote about it because it's just easier for me. I hope you don't mind. I said, during those days, we shared and exchanged our sonic materials and explored ways in which we could extend our musical and performative gesture across and with each other in sonic and physical space, documenting our research with sound and video recordings. As an outcome, we recorded a set of improvisations for 2 pianos, objects, electronics, my accordion, and Magda's clavinet. We also improvised a longer form piece, which was recorded on video. In that collaboration, we really aimed to share our materials and processes. As I said, she's an improviser that normally plays inside the piano, working with a set of preparations she's developed over the years, which provide a huge range of timbral possibilities. In this instance, she worked with objects outside of the piano, some of which were objects she brought, as I said, and some which belong to me, which have been indexical to my sonic identity. So those little objects that I've had for a very long time, and they mean things. They're, like the language means different things, the objects do too.
Maybe I can just add this. Magda Myers has also been here to talk about materiality and about her way of preparation and about objects. And the basis was also, of course, her work, but also her PhD project, which is called Orchestrating Timbre.
Right.
And there she also talks about the meanings of certain objects that come to improvised contexts.
Yeah, it's super beautiful. That's a beautiful thesis if you ever have a chance to read it.
It's also online in the research catalog where you can also find the work of Andrea.
Yes. So when I said I, on the other hand, eschewed working with the instruments with which I have the greatest fluency, accordion and acoustic and electronic keyboards, exposing my engagement with the more intractable materials that I'd been exploring during the lockdown, large rolls of paper, amplified drawing tools, along with the software instrument. And, we talked about it afterwards. We recorded it, and we both kind of said that we felt quite vulnerable because we weren't used to this, but we also felt like something happened. And that's not, I don't have a lot of language to say what happened, but I think there's something about sharing materials and we were sort of trying to think about how could you extend a sonic gesture across a space, a physical acoustic space? How could you share those gestures? I don't know. I think we're going to try it again. I think we were just literally scratching the surface, but that was the intention anyway. And also kind of breaking with issues of our own understanding of how we're fluent in things, and that maybe something can be made by not being fluent, which is something I keep coming back to. So I instigated this project, so Magda let me edit the video, which was kind of her. And in some of the video, she sort of disappears. She kind of fades to white, like she's kind of gone. And I think this was a little bit about my own thinking about subjectivity. You still hear her, you don't see her, and then she kind of reemerges again. So she's coming and going a bit. I want to just show a couple excerpts of that. It's called Pianos, Object, Paper, Drawing, and Electronics, and it's by us both. And it's far too long to watch all of it, but so I'm going to hop around in it a bit. Hope that's okay. It's a long piece, and it would be nice to see all of it, but it's online if you're curious.
Yeah, I mean, we have now seen the contact microphone drawing technique.
Yeah, crude
And,
though it may be. Yeah.
Before we talked about the impossibility of documentation of these kind of processes, also about the exhibition.
Yeah.
It's never really, but you get an idea of the intensity which is going on in the room. I mean, actually, I think even if you don't see the whole thing, you kind of feel the atmosphere and the concentration which is in the room in that moment.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I think so. So where all this led ultimately was that, I collected a huge amount of documentation. I made many, many videos in my apartment, doing authentic movement, and I, working with objects as instruments, and the small, detailed, the small objects and instruments. I was also making spatial audio compositions in the apartment, like with, one speaker in one room and another speaker in my bathroom and another one under the dining room table. And, really trying to think about, okay, well, I don't have, I'm not in a studio, I don't have a sound system. How can I explore these issues where I am, in the situation I'm in? And interestingly, I thought I was going to be making at least 8-channel sound, and I had the capacity to do 4 in my apartment, and it didn't sound good. So in the end, I ended up making, for example, like a piece using piano as a sound source with electronics, and the way I made it was a piece with one speaker in my living room and another Bluetooth speaker playing the same piece, like 4 minutes later, and just spending a lot of time walking between the 2 rooms, the hallway between the living room and the kitchen, and listening to these kind of weird juxtapositions and gaps and the strangeness of it. It started to feel like there was a ghost in another room, and I'm very interested in that sort of sensation. So where all that ended was that I just had a tremendous amount of stuff, and it was always my intention to make a very large-scale installation from sort of my final project for the PhD. And not only for the final project for the PhD, I mean, the thing that should be said, the main thing about the PhD for me, I mean, it's wonderful to, graduate from something and, say you're a doctor, whatever. But for me to have the time and space for the first time in many years to just think and read and consider, how are all these things, how do they come together? Why do I somehow have all these things going on at once, and how could they make sense? What a luxury to be able to do that. And so I am endlessly grateful for that. And also I have to say, I have a new fellowship now here in Berlin with the Berlin Artistic Research Grant Program. And the project I'm doing with that is more or less a continuation of this, although I'm trying to think also how to make the work more collaborative, how to make it, I want to be able to collaborate more with people in this context, and also just think about audiences in different ways. So that's another piece. But I ended up finding this really amazing gallery in Oslo, where I was doing my PhD, that is a gallery for art and architecture. And the person who runs the gallery, it's the first time I've really dealt with a curator. And that was a really amazing experience. It's very different, for example, if you do a music gig, very often, someone will say, well, we'd like you to play in our space, and, we like what you do, so please do what you do. And that's kind of where it ends, often. Not always, but often. And in this case, she was asking me incredible questions that I really appreciated. Like, it really, how she wanted me to be able to articulate what did I want the audience to know, what kind of experience did I want them to have. And of course, this is very elementary, but taking time to really have a dialogue about it was really invaluable. So that was one great thing. So in the end, I did make this installation. It was quite a big thing. It was 14-channel sound and 45 drawings, 2 big video projections, some of which you've already seen, working with the video with Magda, but then also lots of other videos in different scale, very small and medium-sized, many projections of different elements of practice, mainly the drawing practice, so that somehow what happens in the studio, the daily practice is somehow honored. I think that there's something about daily practice, which is what all of this was for me, like me showing up to draw, or me showing up to record, or me showing up to make authentic movement, that is really the stuff that is the work. That's the work. And I wanted to make a piece that honored that, and then also dealt with this sense of the uneasiness of dealing with immersion and wanting to be able to step back out of it into something more dislocated. So I made Diffusing Dislocation, Sonic Spaces for the Stray, and this was in a 2-level gallery space in Oslo, and I'll just read briefly. My intention was to create a long-duration work exploring the condition of dislocation in response to the possibilities of the acoustic and architectural characteristics of that space. So it was very much site-conditional. It was very much, I don't use the word site-specific, but it was really based on what the site was. It was really important to me that it related to that. So I started, I thought I would have like speakers on stands. In the end, I was like hiding speakers in closets and opening and closing doors and being really crude and playful again with the space. So, so dislocation kind of manifests with the way I use the software instrument. But more and more I've been thinking about what does that mean in terms of space, and this was an opportunity to really address that. And to bring the intimate and solitary practice into a public space to see if it works, So I think it did. I don't know. I hope it did. I'm wondering how we're doing for time. I have a trailer of that exhibition, but maybe that's, I don't know if we feel
we
like
can still have a look into the trailer, I would say, but first of all, maybe
how are people doing?
Are there more remarks or questions right at the moment, maybe already? then we just, yeah, okay. Ebro, I come to you.
Thank you. Hi, thank you.
You're welcome.
I was really wondering,
Yes.
probably you're supposed to be mentioned a lot on your thesis, but I'm going to read it ASAP. But I was just wondering the role of listening that you have mentioned, because
Yes.
it's supposed to be, I was imagining that probably your listening experience during the process, it was oriented the music that the music came out at that moment. So I would like to hear more about the role of listening in terms of your memory during the process, or while you're watching it, or even in terms of the witness.
Those are all good questions. It's really hard for me to separate listening from moving. And by moving could also be staying still. I mean, just like the states that the body are in, and then sound. So, it's more of a response. Again, it's this correspondence where, a sound happens, and maybe the sound happens because I made the sound, or the software makes the sound without me, controlling it. And that whether I'm moving quickly or slowly, whether I respond in sound quickly or slowly, I'm still listening. And sometimes when it's a very fast thing, it's almost like a kind of telepathy. It's almost beyond listening. It's just sort of this, especially like when you're working with another person, whether it is another musician who's improvising, or let's say a movement artist who is improvising, that there's this kind of moment that I'm calling listening, but it's even beyond that. It's sort of sensing in a really deep way. And so memory does have a lot to do with it. In fact, Magda Myers talks a lot about memory in relation to her own practice and listening, and how she works with her objects with the piano. I guess, you have the memory of what you think. I mean, it's, this is even stuff that, happens in, psychological research, pattern recognition. I kind of know what will happen because I've done it enough to know that probably X, Y, or Z will happen. And I might not be paying attention, but that would be bad. It would be bad to not pay attention. It would be better to listen, because even if there's a pattern, there might not be, or there might be something else that I want to do in response to that pattern, or I might want to create some air around the pattern. I don't know if this is making any sense, in terms of, I don't know if this is answering your question. I'm not sure that it is. But just speaking about listening for me is like a state of awareness, I guess, really acute awareness. And you might not do anything, or you might do something, in response to what you're listening to. But yeah, I guess I think about that as awareness, and memory comes into that, of course. Anybody else?
So let's maybe just have a look into the training
Yeah.
still of the exhibition to get an idea of this.
Again,
And,
I would say documenting an installation is always disappointing, because the space was it was a beautiful space, which you'll see, but you don't really have a sense of how the sound works so well. It sort of just takes you through it. But it's an interesting space, so we'll just go there. And I don't want to start at the very beginning, because nobody can see. This is from outside. Do we have sound?
Should be there.
Yes, there should be sound. There should be lots of sound. Is the fader down?
All right, so thank you very much, Andrea Parkins.
Thank you for inviting
was,
me. Great to be here.
It was really rewarding to have the time to dive deeply into your work and your thought also.
Thank you.
My proposition is that if you still have questions or if you would like to talk, we continue with a drink and do that right now in a more informal way. Thank you very much again, Andrea. It was a big pleasure to have you here. And yeah, I think that's it for the moment. Thank you for coming. And till next time. Okay.
Thank you.